Comparable to the birth of Christ. Government forces retake Aleppo and the evacuation of the battered and broken survivors begins. The U.S., meantime, calls it a massacre. This is Special Report. Good evening. Welcome to Washington. I'm Bret Baier. It is a watershed moment in the 5-year Syrian civil war. After a relentless offensive augmented by the Russians, the government of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad is once again in control of the rebellion's most important stronghold. Hundreds of thousands of civilians have been killed since the beginning of the war in Syria. The U.S. ambassador to the United Nations says Russia, Iran, and Syria should be ashamed for carrying out war crimes on civilians with barrel bombs, mortars, and airstrikes. Tonight, tens of thousands of Syrians, many women and children, await evacuation from Aleppo and an uncertain future. Correspondent John Huddy has the latest from our Middle East newsroom.
The convoy of buses and ambulances carried the first wave of men, women, and children from eastern Aleppo today, leaving with some hope of life amid so much death. UN officials say the sick and wounded were evacuated first, followed by vulnerable citizens, and then rebel fighters and their families. They've been granted amnesty and safe passage to other parts of Syria. And then there are the children, like this group of orphans. A 10-year-old girl says this may be the last time her voice is heard, and she talks about how her mommy and daddy were killed in airstrikes 2 years ago in Aleppo. The evacuation of some 1,000 civilians today and more than 3,000 rebel fighters effectively ends the 4-year control of eastern Aleppo by opposition forces. Syrian President Bashar al-Assad congratulated Syrians on what he called the, quote, liberation of the city.
This history that is being made now is bigger than the word congratulations.
But the evacuation effort is far from over. An estimated 50,000 people remain in eastern Aleppo, according to the UN, and history has shown that all it takes is a spark to reignite the violence. Violence that Secretary of State John Kerry said includes the slaughter of innocent civilians.
And the Assad regime is actually carrying out nothing short of a massacre. And we have witnessed indiscriminate slaughter, not accidents of war, not collateral damage, but frankly purposeful, a cynical policy of terrorizing civilians.
And Secretary of State Kerry said that the U.S. will do everything possible to save lives in Syria, including restarting peace talks in Geneva, but added the question is if Syria's government and Bashar al-Assad is willing to accept peace. And while this may be the end of a major battle, the battle for Aleppo, it is not the end of Syria's civil war. Bret.
John Huddy live in our Middle East newsroom. John, thank you. Well, what do you think the U.S. role should be in regards to Syria? Let me know on Twitter at Bret Baier. You can use the hashtag Special Report, or on Facebook at facebook.com/BretBaierSR. 2 U.S. defense officials tell Fox News ISIS has taken possession of 3 Russian surface-to-air missile launchers outside of Palmyra, Syria, after retaking the ancient city last weekend. The launchers contain 4 missiles each. A Russian Defense Ministry spokesman says an insignificant number of weapons has been taken by ISIS. The top general in Iraq, meantime, says if Russia does not destroy those weapons, the U.S. will take action. Now that Aleppo has fallen, many experts are asking if President Obama's intense focus on one particular Middle Eastern nation kept the U.S. from doing more to prevent the deaths of untold numbers of innocents. Correspondent Kevin Cork is at the White House tonight to fill in the blanks.
Could President Obama have done more to stop the violence in Syria? Or did his insistence on completing the Iran nuclear deal weaken his resolve to unseat the Assad regime? Those are just some of the questions the administration continues to face as Mr. Obama prepares to leave the White House in just a few weeks.
The use of chemical weapons is and would be totally unacceptable. And if you make the tragic mistake of using these weapons, there will be consequences, and you will be held accountable.
That was the president's now infamous red line back in 2012. But since those comments, Assad has continued to massacre his own people, often with the help of the Russians. Critics suggest it was the president's zeal to push the Iran nuclear deal over the finish line that not only clouded his focus, it enabled other troubling hotspots to percolate.
There's no question that because the entire Obama foreign policy machine was committed to this Iran deal, that they looked the other way on a lot of things. I think the Iran deal forced us to pull our punches in our policy with Russia, especially on Ukraine, because we needed the Russians to get the president's legacy nuclear agreement with Iran.
Other critics have even suggested the deal may have contributed to the surprisingly muted U.S. response to allegations of Russian hacking attempts during the election cycle. But White House officials say the nuclear deal was never about the U.S. or the president's legacy. It was about the world's response to a growing threat.
The successful implementation of the international agreement to prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon was not just a major national security priority of the United States, it was a major national security priority of some of our closest allies and partners in the region and around the world.
And yet so much has happened since the completion of that deal. The Russians have refused to leave Ukraine. They continue to bomb Syria. As for the Chinese, well, they're still operating unabated in the South China Sea. And keep in mind, Bret, that Tehran has basically walked away with $1.5 billion. So while that deal was without a doubt historic, critics wonder if it came at a pretty high cost. Bret?
Kevin Cork live on the North Lawn. Kevin, thank you. We're just getting word from the White House that President Obama will hold his end-of-the-year news conference at the White House, 2:15 Eastern Time. You will see that right here on Fox News Channel. Defense Secretary Ashton Carter is heading home tonight following his final war planning conference with core members of the anti-ISIS coalition. Carter expressed confidence that the Trump administration will continue America's leadership role in the coalition fighting ISIS. The meeting in London came to an end, of a 2-week overseas trip for the Pentagon chief, who will be replaced, of course, after the inauguration. It may appear to many of you tonight that there is a huge circular firing squad right now in Washington on one topic: Congress, the intelligence community, the White House, the Trump transition team, all taking shots at one another. And then there are the Russians. All of these elements fighting over whether Moscow hacked its way into interfering with the U.S. election, how, why, and under whose orders, all of that being debated every day. Chief Intelligence Correspondent Catherine Herridge is following all of it tonight.
The Russian government dismissed reports that Vladimir Putin was personally involved and directed the release of hacked emails from the Democrats. Fox News has independently confirmed that Russian-backed cyber militias began hacking U.S. systems in June 2015, and the operation evolved into an effort to interfere in the U.S. election, and it was sanctioned by the highest levels of the Russian government. The White House spokesman dodged questions on whether the intelligence community's October statement blaming Moscow was code for Putin.
Well, I guess the reference to senior-most officials in Russia would lead me to conclude that based on my personal reading and not based on any knowledge that I have that may be classified or otherwise, pretty obvious that they were referring to the senior-most government official in Russia.
Earlier today, Trump's senior policy advisor dismissed other allegations from the White House spokesman that the president-elect knew the hacks would help him.
That is just remarkable. That is breathtaking. I guess he's auditioning to be a political pundit after his job is over soon. That is incredibly disappointing to hear from the podium of the White House press secretary.
NBC News reported late Wednesday that new intelligence showed Putin personally directed the email releases, and the Russian campaign began as a vendetta against Hillary Clinton. The president-elect today tweeted, "If Russia or some other entity was hacking, why did the White House wait so long to act? Why did they only complain after Hillary lost?" Secretary of State Kerry said he would not comment on intelligence, adding,
The president understood and made clear it's a serious matter. It was a serious matter then. It's a serious matter now as even more information comes out.
The CIA declined to provide a briefer to the House Intelligence Committee today after an urgent request from the Republican chairman Devin Nunes, who is on Trump's transition team. The committee is deeply concerned, Nunes said, that intransigence in sharing intelligence with Congress can enable the manipulation of intelligence for political purposes. Another committee member went further.
Even in the public statements, the Director of National Intelligence, the Director of the FBI, have all said that they don't know what the motive is. If there is a motive, it was just to disrupt the election, not to prefer one candidate over the other.
The White House said today there should be a proportional response, but that was the same language used by the administration in October after the intelligence community concluded the Russian government directed the breach of the Democrats' emails, and there is simply no evidence that any punitive action was ever taken against Moscow. Bret.
Catherine, thank you. President-elect Trump is about to hold his latest thank you tour rally in Pennsylvania at the top of the hour. And you can cross off one more cabinet vacancy as he officially names Montana Congressman Ryan Zinke to head up the Interior Department. Senior national correspondent John Roberts is with the Trump team in Hershey, Pennsylvania tonight.
We're going to undertake one of the great tax reforms and simplifications in American history.
It is the centerpiece and biggest ticket item of Donald Trump's economic plan. Across-the-board tax cuts and a simplification of America's Byzantine tax code.
Massive tax cuts, by the way, for middle-class workers. Massive.
The Middle Class Tax Relief and Simplification Act starts by reducing the number of income tax brackets from the current 7 down to 3. People will be taxed at a rate of 12, 25, or 33%. While Trump claims the middle class gets the biggest cut, an analysis by the Tax Policy Center finds people in the lowest income range would get back about $110. Middle income workers would receive an average of $1,010, while the highest income group, above $3.7 million per year, would have their taxes reduced by a whopping $1.1 million.
You'll be on a conference call doing this?
Yeah. More than 2 decades ago, Brad Canrup made the risky leap from a job with Procter & Gamble to start his own market research firm.
There was many months where we couldn't make the mortgage payment. Get yourself centered.
The early days were a balancing act between success and failure, but now Canrup is squarely in the current top tax bracket and could reap an enormous windfall from Trump's proposed cuts. He says he'd likely save some, give some to charity, and put a bunch back into the economy.
I always think, gosh, wouldn't I like that other house somewhere, or wouldn't I like that car, or wouldn't I like that vacation?
Trump also has more changes in mind, eliminating the so-called marriage penalty, alternative minimum, and death taxes. And he would change the tax structure for freelance or contract workers, taxing them at the same rate he proposes for corporations, 15%.
What are you talking about today?
Barbara Johnson is a freelance makeup artist. Among her jobs, making up many of the guests you see on Fox News.
I want to pay what's fair and at the lowest rate possible.
Johnson's current tax rate is around 24%. The Trump plan would knock nearly 10 points off that.
When I have money, I spend it. I like to be able to invest in my business.
And back to Brad Canrup for a moment. His marketing firm is a so-called S corporation, which means he's taxed at personal income rates. Trump would also include S corporation income in his proposed 15% bracket, which Canrup says could change his whole world.
If you literally took our S-Corp and that was taxed at a much lower rate, that might actually be enough to spur differences in the way we think about our business.
I know all my neighbors will.
But some provisions in Trump's tax plan could actually end up increasing taxes for some people who can ill afford it. Trump would increase the standard deduction to $15,000 for an individual, $30,000 for joint filers. But he would also eliminate personal deductions and the head of household deduction.
Hey, buddy!
Liza Mendez is a single mother of 2 boys. Filing as head of household with 3 personal deductions, her income is reduced by $21,300. But Trump's standard deduction of $15,000 would mean she would pay taxes on an additional $6,300 of income. In other words, she'd pay more tax.
Hopefully I'll be able to still buy groceries like I do, clothes for the kids like I do, the mortgage.
As many as 8 million families may be in the same boat as Mendez. Trump insists his tax cuts for childcare would offset the increase, but Mendez has no childcare costs, relying on family to take care of her boys when necessary. So it may be up to Congress to fix it.
I don't know what the solution is to that, but that definitely is not fair considering we're all hardworking individuals.
While all 3 people we talked to support the idea of tax cuts, they're concerned about 2 things. An equitable application of tax cuts so all income groups pay and receive their fair share, and whether cutting taxes could blow a huge hole in the budget, increasing deficits and debt.
It seems like the more we reduce taxes, if we don't reduce the spending, that we are going to have an issue.
Bret. And that will happen quickly after inauguration. John, thank you. Our 15-part series looking ahead to the first 100 days of the Trump presidency continues tomorrow with the incoming administration's relationship with Russia. A hot topic this week, as you heard, in Washington. If you want to watch or rewatch any of the reports, you can check them all out on foxnews.com/special report. We are just 4 days away from the real presidential election. Monday, the Electoral College will convene and will formally vote. And like almost everything else in this election season, what is normally routine is now anything but. Here's Chief Washington correspondent James Rosen.
Martin Sheen, who played the president on The West Wing, leads actors and musicians urging GOP electors to withhold their votes from Donald Trump, who just last month was elected president in real life. Produced by Unite for America, a pop-up group with a progressive pedigree, the video invokes Alexander Hamilton to argue that the college was designed to block unqualified individuals from becoming president.
I'm not asking you to vote for Hillary Clinton.
I'm not asking you to vote for Hillary Clinton.
But it should certainly be someone you consider especially competent.
Top officials at the Republican National Committee are whipping the college vote set for Monday.
We're in contact, and we don't anticipate any of these electors flipping.
29 states and the District of Columbia bind electors under state laws largely untested in the courts. Colorado, which Hillary Clinton captured, is one of them, and Democratic electors there are suing the state to unbind themselves.
I'm a former United States Marine. This isn't about the party. This is about my country. I am putting my country above my party and above my personal risks.
But Colorado's Secretary of State, a Republican, has vowed to make electors from the Centennial State sign a pledge before Monday's vote so that so-called faithless electors could potentially face perjury charges.
Colorado law was written with the presumption that people would follow the law.
Michigan, which went for Trump-Pence, also binds its electors, builder Jim Rhodes among them.
My moral imperative is to do what the voters in Michigan indicated, and that is to support Donald J. Trump. I don't know what moral imperative means to some of these people who are calling me at all hours of the night.
For the never-Trumpers to prevail, 37 Republican electors would need to defect, abstain, or resign, as one has. Since 1900, only 9 faithless electors have voted for another candidate or abstained. Bret?
James, thank you. And even then, the race would go to the House of Representatives, and the GOP would vote for Trump. We'll explain all of this with the panel as well. Up next, can Yahoo recover from a hack of 1 billion of its accounts? First, here's what some of our Fox affiliates around the country are covering tonight. Fox 13 in Tampa, as the Polk County Sheriff's Office announces the arrest of 114 suspects after a 6-day undercover operation focusing on human trafficking. It was called Operation Not So Silent Night. Among those arrested, a high-ranking official on an area school board. Fox 2 in San Francisco, as the state of California tells Uber to stop using self-driving cars. The state says Uber must have permission. Uber says that's not true because it has humans behind the wheel to intervene if needed. And this is a live look at Miami from our Fox affiliate WSVN. The big story there tonight, officials from the U.S. Coast Guard and the Royal Canadian Navy offloading 26.5 tons of cocaine seized in waters off the eastern Pacific. The drugs are worth an estimated $715 million. They came from 27 separate drug smuggling vessel interdictions and 5 bail recovery operations. That's tonight's live look outside the Beltway from Special Report. We'll be right back. The revelation that information has been stolen from more than 1 billion Yahoo accounts is putting that company's future at risk. Chief Correspondent Jonathan Hunt has an update from Los Angeles.
It's the largest data breach in history. 1 billion accounts targeted, a vast amount of information stolen. Email addresses, phone numbers, birth dates, security questions and answers, passwords too. The White House confirmed the FBI is now involved.
I can't speak from here to the potential scope of material that could be vulnerable or may have been exfiltrated. What I can say is that the FBI is investigating this matter.
Yahoo stock tumbled today, and the breach could affect its deal with Verizon, which agreed to pay $4.8 billion for Yahoo's digital operations earlier this year. According to press reports, Verizon's legal team is considering pulling out of the deal, or at the very least renegotiating the price. Verizon issued a statement which said in part, quote, "We will evaluate the situation as Yahoo continues its investigation. We will review the impact of this new development before reaching any final conclusions." And outside experts warn the hackers will keep coming.
I think that this is the tip of the spear of what we're going to see.
Yahoo claims no financial or banking information was accessed by the hackers, but the information the hackers did get can potentially provide a doorway because so many people use the same passwords for so many sites.
So even if that person doesn't keep their financial information or medical information online, by having the credentials and logging in, it's easy to spoof that person. It's easy to act as that person.
This 1 billion account hack happened about a year before a 500 million account breach that Yahoo has already made public. 1.5 billion accounts in total, and a stark reminder that whether it's on an international, national, or individual level, cybersecurity is going to be a major issue in 2017. Bret?
That's for sure. Jonathan, thank you. More misery tonight for Washington, D.C.'s much maligned transit system. 4 Metro track inspectors and 2 supervisors have been fired for falsifying records after an investigation into a derailment in July. Metro's general manager says the probe revealed what he called a disturbing level of indifference, lack of accountability, and flagrant misconduct. He says 6 more firings or suspensions are pending, and 28 of the rail network's 60 inspectors are facing some kind of discipline. The U.S. is experiencing its worst mumps outbreak in 10 years. Mumps. Correspondent Casey Stiegel is keeping an eye on the situation from Dallas tonight.
It's very scary to know that something like that is around.
Parents in multiple states feeling anxious after top U.S. health officials say they're closely monitoring the largest mumps outbreak in more than a decade.
What we're seeing is a very highly infectious disease moving in a community.
King County near Seattle has reported a growing number of cases in at least 5 public schools. Harvard University has been coping with handfuls of infected students since the beginning of the school year. And over at the University of Missouri, more than 200 people have come down with the virus. The CDC says mumps cases have now surfaced in all but 4 states, with nearly 4,300 infections reported. Arkansas is the epicenter, with nearly 2,200 cases in mostly school-aged children.
What everyone around the state can do is just make sure that you're up to date with your immunizations.
Lack of immunizations in general could largely be to blame for the nationwide outbreak, according to public health officials. Several years ago, rumors circulated that certain vaccines could cause autism in children. While that was later debunked, it still terrified many parents to the point of completely opting their kids out of vaccine programs, something doctors do not recommend to prevent future spread of disease.
There is no doubt that the numbers of cases of mumps has decreased dramatically in the era in which we've had the mumps vaccine.
This virus can be extremely contagious, transmitted through saliva, meaning it can be spread through a cough, sneeze, or even drinking after someone. Symptoms include high fever, swollen cheeks, and headache. Bret?
Casey, thank you. Pro-life advocates say President Obama is once again using regulatory overreach to further an agenda Congress and the American people have rejected. This time it's about federal funding for Planned Parenthood and comes just before the inauguration of a self-proclaimed pro-life president. Correspondent Rich Edson has more from the White House tonight.
2 days before President Obama leaves the White House, his administration will enact a rule protecting federal grant money destined for Planned Parenthood, its affiliates, and other clinics providing abortions. Several states with Republican-controlled governments have tried to ban these providers from receiving federal grant funding. A just-released final rule from the Department of Health and Human Services prevents those state efforts.
This is actually empowering patients to make their own choices about their health care. And that is a principle that should really resonate with conservatives.
The federal government is prohibited from paying directly for abortions, except in cases of rape, incest, or if the mother's life's at risk. The government pays providers like Planned Parenthood for other health and reproductive services. Planned Parenthood says it and its affiliates receive more than $500 million a year from government grants and reimbursements. The Congressional Budget Office says most of that is Medicaid paying for services for low-income Americans. Abortion opponents argue those government payments allow Planned Parenthood to direct other revenue to providing abortions. President-elect Donald Trump said in February he would support blocking federal funds from Planned Parenthood as long as it offered abortions.
No, not while they do abortions. I made that clear.
Congressional Republicans say they will renew efforts to prevent any federal money from financing Planned Parenthood.
Those dollars that are not going to Planned Parenthood and abortion clinics, we are going to do that and provide for that by having those dollars used in the more appropriate settings.
Republicans say they want to instead direct funding to clinics without abortion services. And with Donald Trump in the White House, that could become law. And thanks to a Senate procedural maneuver, Republicans could pass a bill blocking all funding to Planned Parenthood with just a simple majority in the Senate and in the House. Next year, they'll have that, and the White House. Brent?
Rich Edson in the White House briefing room. Rich, thank you. The head of the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, says he will resign on Inauguration Day. Democrat Tom Wheeler's departure will leave Republicans with a 2-to-1 advantage on the FCC. It is typical for the agency chairman to leave with the old administration outgoing, but there had been speculation that Wheeler might stay on. Stocks were up today. The Dow gained 60. The S&P 500 finished ahead 9. The Nasdaq jumped 20. President Obama, President-elect Trump, the Russians, the Iranians, and Syria. We'll talk about all of it with the panel when we come back.
To those who support the Assad regime, the days are numbered.
I am confident that Assad's days are numbered.
The use of chemical weapons is and would be totally unacceptable. And if you make the tragic mistake of using these weapons, there will be consequences and you will be held accountable.
The Assad regime is allowing, and the Assad regime is aiding and abetting, and the Assad regime is actually carrying out nothing short of a massacre.
The Syrian civil war has been going on for a long time. And today you hear the Secretary of State, John Kerry, saying it's a massacre that's happening in Aleppo. Before you heard all the days were numbered. Well, we'll just put a number on those. Since the president first mentioned that, it's been 1,749 days since he said the days were numbered for Bashar al-Assad. Now we are seeing a lot of the killing and now the evacuation of people out of Aleppo. Let's bring in our panel. Fox News senior judicial analyst, Judge Andrew Napolitano. Editor-in-chief of LifeZette, Laura Ingraham. Julie Pace, White House correspondent for the Associated Press, and syndicated columnist Charles Krauthammer. Charles, your thoughts on the latest developments?
Obama imagines that the Obama deal is his legacy. It is not. Aleppo is his legacy. History will remember this as kind of the symbolism of the whole policy of retreat and the inevitable outcome. It's not as if this civil war was going to go one way or the other because of what the United States did. The Civil War was essentially in some kind of equilibrium a year and a half ago when the Russians decided that their side, Assad, was losing. The rebels were actually on the advance in Aleppo and elsewhere. He stepped in to rescue Assad, but then he saw there was no response on the part of the West, no penalties whatsoever, even economic, coming from the United States. And he decided to drive the advantage. And we are reduced now to getting speeches from our UN spokesman pleading, saying to the Iranians and the Russians and to Assad, have you no shame, have you no pity? The answer is obvious, they have none. The only thing that could have stopped this ultimately would have been some kind of deterrent from the United States, warning from the United States to keep the Russians out. We didn't. And now we have what we have.
And Laura, the images out of Syria are painful. Yeah, orphans pleading for their lives.
I mean, as someone who's visited a lot of orphanages and just seeing those children and the eyes of the children,
I think Charles is right. It will go down as, without a doubt, I think one of the biggest humanitarian crises, war crimes obviously committed en masse in Syria. The narrative that you can read on Facebook and other videos released of mothers who are asking priests if they can kill their children so they don't have to see them tortured. So we have to also remember, years ago, when I think the public polling came out on this, remember there was no public support for going into Syria. We also all have to remember that. Obama was seeing those polls. And I think it's also hard because after Iraq, the nation was incredibly war weary. We'd lost thousands of men, more than $1 trillion, and the public just was like, what are we going to gain here? So that was the sentiment, but this is the outcome of what's happened.
Julie, how much of this and the situation we're in with Syria was about the Obama administration and the president concerned about the Iran deal, concerned that he didn't want to do something that upset Iran, and thereby didn't do anything. And by not doing anything, he was doing something.
I think that now, 5 years later, you can look at some of these pieces and maybe draw those conclusions. But I actually think in real time, if you go back to, I remember this very well, that weekend when he took the walk around the South Lawn with Dennis McDonough and decided to pull back on airstrikes. I really believe that that was more about what Laura was talking about, a country that was war weary, a president who had won 2 elections at that point on promises of withdrawing the United States from the Middle East. I think this was more about him trying to maintain that piece of his legacy. But Charles is exactly right. This whole dynamic changed when the Russians went into Syria to actively protect Assad. The idea that we are here now trying to negotiate with the Russians is something that didn't have to happen if we had been involved more actively earlier.
Judge, here's the Washington Post, the editorial board. Aleppo represents a meltdown of the West's moral and political will, and in particular a collapse of U.S. leadership by refusing to intervene against Assad's regime's atrocities or even to enforce the red line he, President Obama, declared on the use of chemical weapons. President Obama created a vacuum that was filled by Vladimir Putin and Iran's Revolutionary Guard. As recently as October, Mr. Obama set aside options drawn up by his advisors to save Aleppo. Instead, he supported the delusional diplomacy of Secretary of State John F. Kerry, whose endless appeals to Moscow for ceasefires yielded, as Mr. Putin no doubt intended, nothing more than a humiliating display of American weakness. This is the vacuum in which a President Trump steps into on Syria.
Yes, it may sound funny, but I could not agree more with the editorialists at the Washington Post on this. This is a brilliant and tragic description of President Obama's utter and John Kerry's utter lack of leadership. Leadership so bad that they've made the situation worse. My concern is, and Laura raised this, and it's well known, does the American public have the stomach, have the appetite for the introduction of military force into Syria, which would inevitably lead to ground troops? Do we want to go through all that again? But this is a terrible, terrible tragedy that's going to be put on Donald Trump's desk at noon on January 20th. I don't know which way he's going to go, but the last time he spoke about this, he did not see an appetite amongst the American people for ground troops.
That, I think, is a wrong alternative. People talk about there are only 2 alternatives: the passivity of Obama, which ended today with Aleppo, or invasion. When the red line was crossed, we were in a position, the French were going to help us, of purely an attack from the air or by cruise missiles to wipe out the Assad Air Force and to disable the airfields. That is not invasion. That would have meant you can't drop the barrel bombs. And secondly, when the Russians started to maneuver, we didn't have to invade. The job of a superpower is to deter the other superpower. There was no penalty the Russians had to pay at any stage in tipping the balance in the war. And that was a role that we could have played short of anything like a ground invasion. And to put it up as the only alternative, I think, is to back up the Obama decision of doing nothing, and we see the result now.
A couple of Fox polls, Laura. President Obama's job performance on the list of items, including the economy, foreign policy, roughly split. ISIS is upside down in this poll. 41% approve, 51% disapprove. And then the question, is the U.S. safer since President Obama took office? Less safe, 43% now. And then you see safer, 20%, same, 35%. I guess the real question about Syria is how much this has spurred on on not only ISIS but other terrorist groups and what that means for us.
Yeah, that are emboldened. I mean, we forget Libya. I mean, the limited intervention policy of the Obama administration with those limited strikes in Syria in 2011 helped, of course, topple Libya, and Libya is now a terrorist haven. I mean, the foreign policy calamities go on and on and on. You know, first the pullout of troops from Iraq, obviously the Iran revolution we didn't support, obviously Benghazi, and this just stuff adds up. And so now the public is, with the benefit of hindsight, saying, gosh, what is our standing in the world? What was our foreign policy, and what is America today? And that is the mood. Andy's right. The mood that the country was in when they elected Trump. Trump is not like rah rah, let's go intervene. He wants a more pragmatic foreign policy that understands the limits of our money, what we have to spend, and the public's will to fight. We still have to have a public who backs up the wars that we're in, and we have to keep the public with the war effort. And I think Bush obviously lost the public in the second Bush term.
We don't really know, though, what the Trump foreign policy will be.
We don't. He has talked at times about putting in troops and taking them out quickly, not having long-term commitments overseas, but he inherits this in, I think, about 5 weeks, and he is going to be inheriting a situation in Syria that is much more complicated than it was when Obama made the decision on the red line.
I just don't see him doing militarily the opposite of what he promised the American public to do, though I sympathize very much emotionally and morally with Charles's argument.
But apart from the emotion and the morality of it, we have an entirely new strategic situation now in the Middle East, where Iran and Russia now have total control of Syria and will use it as a base of projecting force, malevolent force, in the region. So Trump's dilemma is not going to be, do I intervene in the Civil War? It's essentially over, and the bad guys have won. Now he's going to have to inherit a really hostile power, an outpost of Iran in a crucial area in the Middle East, and that's the legacy.
Iran was the focus of the Obama administration foreign policy, clearly. The question is whether Russia will be the focus of the Trump foreign policy. Next up, the Trump transition, pressure on electors, plus Russia and hacking, and the latest.
Is completely phony. What they're asking people to do is to ignore the votes of millions of people in their states who elected them as elector.
Okay, this is an ad by celebrities out there trying to ask the Republican electors that meet December 19th to not vote for Donald Trump, to vote for somebody else, and thereby send it to the House of Representatives. If you remember, Donald Trump has 306 electoral votes, Hillary Clinton 232. The Constitution says that you have to finish in the top 3 in electoral votes. So far, they're the only 2 with votes. If what these celebrities said actually happened, it would then go to the House of Representatives, where they would vote for Donald Trump. We're back with the panel. It's mind-boggling to me.
It's a little confounding, and I would compel the celebrities in that ad to read a story by some of my fine AP colleagues who have spent the last several days tracking down these electors, asking them what they're going to do, and they found a grand total of 1 Republican elector who said they will not vote for Trump. So I think this is a bit of a wild goose chase on their part.
Okay, I wanted to deal with that right off the top. Laura, Trump tweeting today on Russia. If Russia or some other entity was hacking, why did the White House wait so long to act? Why did they only complain after Hillary lost? Here's Donald Trump back in his last press conference, July 27th, in the White House today.
Russia, if you're listening, I hope you're able to find the 30,000 emails that are missing.
The defense from the Trump campaign is that he was joking. I don't think anybody at the White House thinks it's funny that an adversary of the United States engaged in malicious cyber activity to destabilize our democracy. That's not a joke.
Laura, his rhetoric from the podium has increased over the last couple of days on this very issue.
Yeah, I think how heartwarming that meeting between Obama and Trump was in the Oval, and they've been talking, regularly, fairly complimentary. Trump was of Obama, and this is what he gets for it, kind of the back of the hand. I think it's pretty obvious that Trump made that offhand comment in the summer. I don't think he was really telling Vladimir Putin to hack the U.S. computers. I mean, that's not what he would do. But it doesn't surprise me at all that Josh Earnest, Obama's press secretary, speaking for the president, would be another agent provocateur trying to, just like with the entire Russia story, delegitimize the Trump victory. The Trump victory was a repudiation of the failures in our economy, the failures in the national confidence, and our failure in foreign policy. Across the board, it was a repudiation of that. In the Rust Belt, the Midwest, the Middle Americans who turned out in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Ohio, Iowa, and beyond. They rejected what Hillary was going to do, which was going to continue the Obama term. And by the way, where was Barack Obama and all the lefties when all of us were talking about the Soviets in the 1980s? When it was the Soviet Union, they were all railing against Reagan and calling him Ronnie Reagan. Now they're all worried about Russia. I just find it, we needed them back in the 80s, and they were nowhere to be found.
Charles.
Look, Putin is actually succeeding in a sense. If you wanted to destabilize the American system and to turn people against each other, well, he's produced it. You've got CIA, you've got FBI, Democrats, Republicans, committee chairmen, all at each other's throats. The issue here isn't who elected Donald Trump. The American people did. The issue is the power of the Russians and presumably others to get into our systems and disrupt what we do. And the deeper issue is we've had an administration, it's the same in Aleppo, it's the same in Ukraine, same everywhere, that does nothing, does absolutely nothing to deter the other power. The point of a superpower is not to invade, it's not to drop the bombs, it's to be so strong that when you issue a warning, secretly or publicly, the other guy listens and doesn't do it. And we are going to suffer from the fact that Putin has gotten away with this and succeeded to the extent he has us at each other's throats. Trump is going to have to be a president who gets in there and does something, a retaliation that is really going to singe the Russians.
Judge, you can respond to this, but I want to ask you about the transition and a meeting, but go ahead.
Well, I don't think that there's any evidence that the Russians hacked. The definition of hacking being entering an operational system and altering what's recorded there. And Julian Assange has said, told our friend Sean Hannity, it'll be aired later on tonight, that his source was not the Russians. Who knows who the source was?
Yeah, they think that the Intelligence Department, the ODNI, the National Intelligence Director, put out a statement. They think that it may be actors like Guccifer and others who were working somehow with the Russian government.
But that is leaking. That is the revelation of private and truthful information on which voters may have made their decisions. That is not altering an operational system so that vote totals were changed.
No, right, exactly. It's interfering with the overall election or the coverage of it. I want to ask you quickly about your meeting today.
The president-elect is nearing the end of his choice for cabinet officers and is beginning to concentrate on the Supreme Court, and he's begun to call people in, and I was privileged to be one of those people, and we spoke for an hour today about the Constitution, about the Supreme Court, and about the process for choosing the replacement for Justice Antonin Scalia.
All right, so not betraying confidence here, but any little nugget? Are we going to see a nominee before inauguration?
I think so. I think that's his goal. I think he's going to begin to concentrate on finding a younger version of Justice Scalia and have that name out there before he's inaugurated.
Breaking news right here at the panel. Judge, thank you. That's it for the panel.